Shays Rebellion, Part 1, Mob Riot or Civil Disobedience. Written and narrated by Stephen Leslie. We often speak about the events of 1776 as a revolution, but it is perhaps more accurately described as a war of independence. The wealthy merchants from the cities of the North and the slaveholding plantation owners of the South, who gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress in September 1774, were not interested in a redistribution of wealth or reordering class society, let alone freeing the enslaved, granting the vote to women, or recognizing the rights of indigenous people. Their main intent was to secure their own interests and rights to practice ravenous, colonialist capitalism free of the yoke of the British monarch. However, in order to muster military resistance to the British, these colonial one-percenters needed to convince the common man that taking up a musket and joining the cause was in their own best interest. The rallying cries of freedom and liberty from British rule struck a chord with laborers and small farmers who volunteered in droves. The playbook of the authoritarian leader in America always includes rallying the poor whites against some external threat, whether it be the British tyrant, the savages, freed blacks, migrants, communists, socialists, queer people, Muslims, etc. And while the terms of freedom stated by the founders were certainly not purely for propaganda purposes, the meaning they held for the elites was meant to play out in the context of a post-revolutionary continuity of class structure, while the symbolic significance those words assumed for the working poor diverged sharply from the aristocracy and evolved to mean equity and access to wealth for all. The Declaration of Independence became the unintended beacon for the masses, pointing toward the ever reimagined, yet ever constant goal of achieving the American dream. For many of those common people, the members of the 99% who volunteered or were later conscripted to fight for the Continental Army, the years immediately following the end of the conflict brought bitter disappointment. They found themselves living the reality described in the lyrics from the song Won't Get Fooled Again by the British rock band The Who. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. The infamous Shays Rebellion was painted by the authorities as mob violence perpetrated by a bunch of slovenly anarchists who refused to pay their just due to an orderly and democratically elected government. In reality, the rebellion was a well-organized protest movement against the lack of legitimate representation, corrupt governance, and the extreme economic hardship imposed on rural residents of Western Massachusetts by the state legislature in the post-war period. Matters heated up in August of 1786 and came to an abrupt and violent climax in the early winter of 1787. Although the rebellion in itself might be considered an obscure footnote to the closing years of the war, the agrarian uprising was to have consequential effect upon the founding fathers and the profound historical events that immediately ensued in its wake. In the winter of 1780, while the war was still raging, Massachusetts convened a special assembly in Boston to vote on a new state constitution. State legislators James Baldwin and Samuel Adams had been previously appointed to draft the new Constitution along with John Adams, who was in effect the primary author of the proposed document. On account of severe winter weather, of the 247 towns invited to send delegates to the convention to decide on adoption, only 47 were able to attend, and these were all from eastern townships within a 10 to 15-mile radius of Boston. The western towns had little to no representation. At this convention, the Boston merchants who had replaced the British authorities contrived regressive tax laws favorable to themselves and at the expense of the yeomen, the small farmers. The new Constitution included a stipulation that it could not be subject to amendment for a period of 15 years. John Hancock was the first governor of the state of Massachusetts. Although a wealthy shipping heir, Hancock had a deep populist streak. Although Hancock had a taste for the refined life of the elite and drove about Boston in a fancy carriage, his administration eased debts on farmers, was willing to receive devalued paper currency, or elsewise turn a blind eye to non-compliance of debt payment. However, ill health kept him out of the running for office in 1785. He claimed to suffer from gout. His critics observed that his malady tended to flare up whenever he needed a convenient excuse to withdraw from controversial political issues. Another wealthy Boston merchant, James Baldwin, the same who as a legislator had helped draft the Constitution, was elected, and he had no sympathy for the delinquent debtors whatsoever. Baldwin, a former president of the Bank of Boston, was determined to enact austerity measures to draw down the state debt and at the same time dedicated to enriching himself and his cronies through patronage. Under his new administration, with a compliant legislator sympathetic to the interests of the Eastern Seaboard, a regressive poll tax was placed on the head of every male 16 years or older, regardless of their economic status. The other principal means of collecting revenue was property tax, 30 and 60% of the total revenue, respectively. Most of the merchants owned relatively little property, their wealth being tied up mainly in the inventory of goods in which they traded, so this tax was disproportionately leveled on the yeoman landholders. Debtors who could not pay had to go to court, which meant hiring a lawyer and paying expensive court fees. If they could not settle their debts, they were consigned to debtors' prison, where they were responsible for paying for their own housing and food. If they had no money for that, they fell deeper into debt. Payment of debt could be exacted upon everything a person owned, including excluding the clothes on their back. Failure to pay property tax would result in foreclosure on the house, the farm, the equipment, and the livestock of the yeoman farmer, everything they required to keep their families alive and to survive in the world. When all was said and done, most of the Western farmers found themselves taxed at a rate of a third of their income. Further, the new Constitution raised the minimum wealth and property requirements for eligibility to vote to 60 pounds, about the price for 100 acres of land, resulting in an economic bar set much higher than the one set under British rule at 40 pounds. To be eligible to run for public office as a state representative, one had to own 600 acres, and to be a senator, well, one had to be a member of the wealthy elite. It was likely well known among the yeomen that in the nearby Republic of Vermont, any adult white male had the right to vote and run for office regardless of their wealth or lack thereof. Universal suffrage for all male citizens would also be mandated in the future U.S. Constitution. In many ways, the emergent clash between Jeffersonian rural tradition versus Hamiltonian commercial expansion was played out in the agrarian byways of western Massachusetts of the 1780s. There are a host of words commonly used to describe the events that transpired in the country of Appalachia North, words such as rebellion, insurgency, insurrection, and uprising. It can be argued that what really took place was a counter-revolution from the bottom up in the aftermath of the War of Independence, which had been a revolution from the top down. The counter-revolutionaries involved in Shays' rebellion were no Tory sympathizers, nor did they pine for a return to the crown. They had defied British rule by putting their own flesh and blood on the line in the war, only to find the old order reestablished with a vengeance in Massachusetts. All they demanded of the new government was equal rights and justice under the law. The American elites who had issued the Declaration of Independence were not looking to foment a restructuring of the social order, but once the flames of liberty were sparked in the breasts of the common men and women who fought and died for the cause, such aspirations would not be easily quelled. The appellation Shays' Rebellion was an invention of the contemporary media of the time. The intent was to splash the entire movement as a bunch of lawless, drunken sons of immigrants, lazy, dirt-poor farmers who eschewed their debts and refused to pay their lawful taxes, an unprovoked, bloodthirsty mob that, if not annihilated, would storm Boston and burn the city to the ground. The reports also cast shade by insinuating there were paid British agents in the ranks, even though the Tories in the Western region were staunchly opposed to the revolt. The rebellion was a grassroots uprising, and several leaders spontaneously emerged. The one common denominator was that they were all veterans of the war, and some, like Shays, belonged to local, lawfully assembled militias. Born in 1747, former Captain Daniel Shays was a farmer from Pelham, Massachusetts, who had volunteered and served honorably in the Continental Army. Shays fought at Bunker Hill and later in campaigns in New York, including the important battle at Saratoga. So distinctive was his service that he was presented with a ceremonial scabbard by none other than the Marquis de Lafayette, whose command he had served under in New York. The poor son of Irish immigrants who had arrived in the colonies as indentured servants, Shays had started out in life as a hired laborer, but he married well, worked hard and ably, and eventually succeeded in acquiring his own 250 acres of Hampshire County land, thereby achieving the rank of a respectable middle-class farmer. But after the war, he was forced to sell off more than half of his acreage in an attempt to settle his debts and avoid debtor's prison. Although the authorities in their mouthpieces would raise Shay's profile as the leader of the revolt, he was just one of several leaders, and initially a rather reluctant one, at the front of a populist agrarian uprising. When first asked by his fellows to lead the 70 local militiamen from Pelham into the protests, Shay deferred to others to take command, though he readily joined in the ranks. In 1786, the population of western Massachusetts was 85% farmers. Most of these were much like Daniel Shays, smallholders known as yeomen, who were largely subsistence farmers, many of them of Scots-Irish descent. These farmers had made do in a pre-war economy based on barter of goods and services. Prior to the war, there was no paper money in circulation, and the common man rarely came into possession of silver or gold. What couldn't be produced on the farmstead could be traded for in goods and kind. In a year with a bad harvest, local merchants would extend a line of credit to the farmers to be redeemed in produce the following season. The taxes now levied on the farmers were 3 to 4 times higher than what they had paid under British colonial rule. The British had allowed them to pay their tax debt with labor or in kind with livestock or other agricultural commodities. After the war, the former 13 colonies all experienced economic recession. In Massachusetts, the British Navy was blockading access to their fisheries and had closed major ports in the Caribbean to their trade and commerce interests. Former trading partners in Europe would no longer extend credit to the Boston traders and demanded payment in cash for goods. In rural Massachusetts, this translated into depressed prices for farm commodities. Since the Boston merchants could not get lines of credit from European traders and were themselves forced to deal in hard cash, they thought it only natural to pass this hardship on down the economic food chain to the local merchants who dealt directly with the farmers. At the outbreak of the War of Independence, the great promise made to the poor laborers and previously indentured common people was that they could one day attain property to operate small farms of their own, an unimaginable dream to the lower classes left behind in Europe. Like most returning soldiers, Captain Shays was waiting on the back pay still owed him for his services in the army. Times grew so desperate, he even sold off his ceremonial sword. A number of the returning veterans had been conscripts, forced into 3-year tours of duty. They had been promised that 20 pounds and 100 acres of land would be their reward upon victory. Many veterans didn't get the money, and none ever received the land. For those veterans who had received any compensation, it had come in the form of bonds or paper notes. Under the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. government had no power of taxation. This was left to the states, who were then to pay their share of the national debt to the Congress. Both the U.S. government and the states were carrying enormous debt accrued funding the war, money owed to foreign governments such as France, Spain, and Holland, plus money borrowed from wealthy financiers at home. From the point of view of the men on the ground like Shays, the colonial leaders had become a new regime of out-of-touch ruling elites that was simply trying to replace their former British masters. The soldiers came back to their farms from the war, still waiting for the promised back pay for their military service, only to find the banks backed by the wealthy merchants in Boston were in the act of foreclosing on their buildings, auctioning off their crops, livestock, and land. Another of the grand promises of the Revolution had been the annulment of farm debt, but after the war, legislators enacted new taxes and laws enforcing the powers of government and banks to collect on debts that had previously been settled in payment with crops or through barter. In an attempt to achieve fiscal solvency, the Massachusetts legislature passed laws making it legal for merchants to not accept the paper currency that had been issued to the veterans. Taxes could no longer be paid with trade in kind, not even with paper money. Only silver or gold would suffice. There was a shortage of paper money and very little gold and silver in circulation to pay with, even if they could. When veterans facing debt demanded that the state print more money to ease the foreclosure crisis, the legislature decided in favor of the creditors and denied the petition. The paper bonds issued to soldiers at the end of the war, or notes they received later, decreased rapidly in value. To add insult to the burden, tax debtors were often required to make the expensive and time-consuming journey to appear at the state court in Boston to have their cases heard. Wealth, power, and urbanity dominated eastern Massachusetts. The governing body and high court were located in Boston. The majority of delegates to Congress were elected from the eastern side of the state. Desperate men returning to abandoned and overgrown farms, wives had either followed their husbands to the war front or gone to live with relatives, were hard up for cash and sold off their bonds at 20% or less than their original worth. The majority of these bonds were bought up on speculation by wealthy Boston elites who then fixed things in the legislature to secure their payment at full face value. In 1786, 35% of the legislators owned 40% of the government bonds. 80% of note holders lived in or near to Boston. Baldwin himself held 3,000 pounds in notes. Colleagues of the governor, such as the president of the Bank of Boston who succeeded him in that position, held as much as 30,000 pounds in notes per man. The action of the legislature meant that in order to collect on its debts while granting full value to the notes, the state would have to double its revenue collection. Its answer was to further increase taxation on the poor farmer veterans who had sold their bonds to stave off starvation. Now they were not only paying off their debts, the legislators were wringing blood out of stone by taxing them so that the wealthy could cash in on the full value of the bonds the veterans had been forced to sell off at a fraction of their initial value. As the summer of 1786 approached, 73 towns, representing 30% of the total of townships, had convened in their local meeting houses, usually the taverns, to draft petitions. Their principal requests were lower tax rates and judicial reform. Judges were appointed by the legislature to make the system operate more fairly. Some also called for the capital to be moved further west. Massachusetts was the only state in which in which the hub city and the capital were combined. By this time, 30% of the population in the western counties had been summoned to appear in court, and hundreds were imprisoned. For years, the small farmers of the western townships had tried doing what was in their legal purview to remedy their desperate plight. They voted, but were underrepresented in the legislature. They wrote petitions signed by the citizens, but they were ignored. They drafted lists of reforms that they duly submitted for consideration by the representatives. Only when all else failed and the debt crisis continued unabated did they resort to civil disobedience. For the rich and powerful, it was a convenient foil to paint the civil disturbances in post-war Massachusetts as the boiling resentment of a bunch of hot-headed yeoman farmers out in the sticks. This was the line taken by the Eastern elites and the line touted in the press. But the reality was far more nuanced. The Shaysites, as they came to be called, referred to themselves as regulators after the class warfare movement that had flared up in South Carolina in 1766 while still under British rule. Their contemporary critics, such as Secretary of War Henry Knox and another former aide-de-camp of Washington, David Humphreys of New Haven, Connecticut. Humphreys would later become an ambassador to Spain and assist William Jarvie in the plot to smuggle merino sheep into the U.S., referred to them as levelers, a fear-mongering reference to another populist movement for wealth redistribution that flared up between the two English civil wars in the mid-17th century. In inflammatory reports that both men wrote to George Washington in 1786, they indicated that, if not immediately crushed, the Shays insurrection would inevitably spread to neighboring states, painting the specter of 10 to 15,000 rural rabble in revolt. In July of 1786, not having considered a single petition or given answer to any list of grievances sent from various conventions of selectmen, the legislature announced it would adjourn for 8 months. This was the final straw for the western townships. On August 29th, an assembled militia marched on the Court of Common Pleas in Northampton and successfully shut it down, informing those present for hearings that they did not find it convenient that they should convene court on that day. Governor Bowdoin sent out a proclamation denouncing the mob action and ordered the state militiamen to mobilize. Shutting down the courts was a direct action aimed at stopping the lawyers from prosecuting the debt grievances of the merchants, stopping the judges from pronouncing their decisions, stopping the tax collectors from serving their writs, and stopping the sheriffs from serving their warrants. The veterans who swelled the ranks of the regulators had suffered extreme privation in the war, which had seen its share of mutinies and subsequent executions, oftentimes enduring harsh winter encampments without adequate provisions, blankets, or boots. Some of the older regulators were hardened by decades of conflict, many having fought in the French and Indian Wars prior to the Revolution. Those wars had been instigated by greedy land speculators, including George Washington, who was a surveyor and later a military enforcer for the Ohio Company, making illegal land claims on Haudenosaunee, Iroquois territory in the Ohio Valley, and selling tracts to settlers. These hardened veterans were used to enduring protracted campaigns. The officers like Shays and Captain Luke Day from West Springfield did not lightly muster their neighbors to resistance. They knew firsthand the horrors of war and what it meant to carry the weight of leading men into battle to face mutilation and death. Shays was present at the action in Northampton, though he still insisted he was not a leader in the movement. On September 26th, he and Captain Day marched into Springfield at the head of 300 men to shut down court proceedings scheduled for that day. Major General William Shepard, in command of the 4th Division of the State Militia, anticipated them and surrounded the building with a like number of troops. The two armies paraded before one another and engaged in a grim stare-down, but no side advanced and no shots were fired. The presiding judge nonetheless decided it would be prudent to not hold court, and so action of the regulators was successful, despite the show of state militia force. When regulators shut down the court in Worcester on September 2nd, Governor Bowdoin called out the local militia, but most of the men stood down, either sympathetic to the protesters or already standing among their ranks. A similar crisis in neighboring Rhode Island was diffused when the legislature forced merchants to trade in bonds at devalued rates. But Bowdoin held fast against any such conciliatory measures. Instead, he ordered the Massachusetts High Court to issue warrants of arrest for 11 men identified as leaders of the insurrection. More protests followed in early October, shutting down courts in Great Barrington, Concord, and Taunton. In Great Barrington, 1,000 state militiamen were called up to guard the courthouse. Unexpectedly, one of the militia captains called for a vote, saying those wishing to see the court open should step to the right side of the road, and those in favor of closing it down should step to the left. A full 800 of the militiamen stepped to the left to stand with the regulators. There were no hearings held in court that day. Instead, the regulators coerced the three judges present into signing a pledge to stop hearing debtors' cases. The triumphant marchers next proceeded to release all the debtors held in the Great Barrington jail. A contemporary observer of the events that day recorded that not one act of private courage was committed during the whole transaction. Not one act of private outrage was committed during the whole transaction. Does history exhibit such another transaction as this, yet every citizen secure in his person and property? The observer noted that the Hampshire and Worcester court closings had also been successfully orchestrated with effective nonviolent action. The regulators found an unlikely ally in a Berkshire County judge and physician named William Whiting. Formerly a conservative, Whiting was disgusted by the corruption he saw in the legal system, which was clearly rigged against the yeoman farmers. He was particularly incensed by the actions of the legislature in support of the greedy speculators buying up the war bonds. Whiting bravely refused to open his court to hearings in solidarity with the insurgents. He published his views in an essay in the local newspapers and was sued for seditious libel over it. In the essay, Dr. Whiting expressed his view of the fundamental principles of government, namely, the equal protection, prosperity, and happiness of all its subjects. He went on to say that whenever it happens in any republican government or commonwealth that some part of the citizens have it in their power by compulsion to enrich themselves by the same means that impoverishes and depresses some other orders of people, that government is either defective in its original constitution or else the laws are unjustly and unequally administered. Job Shattuck of Groton was a moderately well-to-do farmer with 500 acres and a three-story house. The rebellion could very easily have been attributed to him, as he began openly agitating for an uprising against tax collection as early as 1782, though as we shall see, injury took him out of the final action. But neither did Shattuck fit the stereotypical profile of an anarchist yeoman rabble-rouser that the authorities wished to project upon public opinion. When Job Shattuck and his fellow militiamen from Worcester County shut down the courthouse in Concord, Governor Bowdoin decided he needed to make an example of him. Concord lay just 20 miles to the northwest of Boston and was too close for comfort. 300 state militia, led by the sons of the Boston Blue Bloods, rode out with a warrant for arrest and attacked a contingent of regulars in a private home where Shattuck was found hiding. In the ensuing struggle, Shattuck was slashed across the back of the knee with a saber, a wound which crippled him for life. He was then hauled off and imprisoned in Boston. This was the first blood shed in the insurgency, and as news spread of it, the yeoman farmers became incensed.